You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 353, and in this one I got back on Jon Hershfield. Jon is a psychotherapist and director of the Centre for OCD and Anxiety at Sheppard Pratt. He is also the author of 6 OCD books, and he's been on this podcast many times before. So in this one, we discuss what's new with Jon, the book he's working on, borderline personality disorder, or BPD for short, OCD and BPD, common overlaps in traits, causes of BPD, how BPD may complicate therapy for OCD and how to navigate this, Dialectical behaviour therapy, words of hope, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. And thank you as always to you guys for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And thank you to Jon for his time. And without further ado, here he is. Welcome back to the show, Jon.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you back on. So I guess initially, just what's new with you? What do you want to share or just update us on?
Well, I'm not recall exactly the last time we spoke, but I'm still employed, so that's always good. I'm directing the Center for OCD and Anxiety at Sheppard Pratt, which is an outpatient center, and then we also provide an OCD program within the Retreat, which is a residential center, and that continues to evolve. Also, we're in the process of sort of building the framework for an OCD-focused adolescent residential center here at Sheppard Pratt. So that's very exciting. And then in the meantime, I've been working on this book that's going to be kind of the subject that we're going to discuss today, called the Unwanted Thoughts and Intense Emotions Workbook, which is combining what I understand about CBT and ED for unwanted thoughts with Dr. Blaise Aguirre, who's a psychiatrist from McLean, his understanding of DBT for intense emotions, and we kind of combined it into one book for people who struggle with both.
Yeah, brilliant. So we're obviously going to talk about OCD and borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yes.
But I guess we can also talk about this in a non-diagnosis way of just, as you said, the book title is when people have intense emotions or unwanted thoughts. So I guess I don't know if it's useful for you to just talk from a diagnosis standpoint or a more kind of symptom, right? Or mix it.
I mean, you raise a good point. You know, there's reasonable people can debate the utility of the names of things, right? If we didn't have a name for OCD and it was just people with unwanted thoughts who struggled to handle uncertainty around them, we would still have OCD. And for some people, being able to call it OCD gets them to the treatment that they need, the resources that they need, and also an understanding of themselves as a person with OCD, which, you know, can be very helpful on the stigma front. What's interesting is you don't find exactly the same thing with borderline personality disorder. So any personality disorder is really just a cluster of traits, right? People show up in different ways in the world. Some people are a lot like this and some people are a lot like that. When certain traits are more severe and more rigid, meaning when it's useful for you to soften those traits in certain situations and you have difficulty doing that, we might say that's a rigid trait. And when they show up in certain patterns, the American Psychiatric Association and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders gives it a name, right? So this pattern of traits is called this kind of personality disorder, and this pattern of traits is called this other personality disorder. And why is that useful? Well, if you understand that many people show up in the world with these particular combinations of traits, and it causes them these particular difficulties, then you can look for, you know, which treatment skills, or in some cases medications, might help you loosen your mind's grip on those ways of being in the world. Borderline personality disorder is a particularly interesting one, I think, because it has 9 criteria, meaning, you know, sort of 9 traits. And again, these are traits that people have. You could have one of these traits, and that doesn't mean you have this condition, but the it has more to do with the combination of traits and their severity. And there's 9 potential criteria, but you only need to meet 5 of them for someone to say, okay, I'm going to diagnose you with borderline personality disorder. And we can go over the specifics of the traits later, but they mostly have to do with how you relate to intense emotions, specifically in relation to other people and your feelings around attaching and connecting with other people, but also how you relate to yourself. And when you think about that, so you only need to meet 5 of the 9 criteria to meet the diagnosis. It's very likely that you'll have almost nothing in common with another person with BPD, right? You could share one trait, for example, and the 4 traits that you don't have, they might be things that seem very scary for you or very strange for you, or you might assume all people with borderline personality disorder are this way because the more disturbing traits are the ones that we see the most of in the media, impulsivity, suicidality, things like that. And you might not have those things, but you might have these other traits as well. And then there's this name. I wish I could speak competently to how the name came about, but I think we can all agree it's not the best name for a disorder. And it's so often used in colloquial language as a pejorative, right? Oh, you're so borderline. I mean, they do it with OCD too, but it's generally meant to be stupidly cute, like, oh, he's so OCD. It's not meant to be overtly punitive, although it's offensive.
Yeah.
Or it's like, oh, you're so borderline is definitely not a compliment, right? Yeah. And that's very unfortunate because I think the stigma around just the words and the diagnosis and people's assumptions about it, that it's this one way, when in fact, if you know one person with borderline personality disorder, that's all you know about borderline personality disorder. It doesn't give you a whole lot of information about something else. It makes it, for the patients I've worked with who do have this diagnosis, very difficult to be able to do the things that people with OCD can usually do, like find a support group and feel good about being around other people who have OCD, or open up to their families and say, hey, I've got OCD and here's a book about it and here's its treatment. You could, with OCD, you could Google it and probably, come up with mostly decent information, right? You're going to find some information that isn't, right? But I wouldn't recommend somebody Google borderline to understand it better. And again, this is really tragic because, like OCD, it is a treatable condition. It is a normal part of the human condition to find yourself with a cluster of personality traits that you need some help with. And I think anything that keeps people from accessing accurate information or feeling like it's safe to even look for accurate information, that's something we have work to do on.
Yeah, really good points. And thank you for kind of breaking down the stigma. Yeah, so let's define some terms. So you've obviously done a good job of starting to break down what makes up BPD potentially. Obviously, many of my listeners, as you know, have a diagnosis of OCD or think they may do, and they may not be at all familiar with borderline personality disorder. So I guess, if you wanted to go into the traits or anything like that, just to help us understand it a bit better.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm gonna literally just kind of read through them and kind of riff on them for a little bit. One other point I want to make too about this distinction we make between what we used to call Axis 1 and Axis 2 disorders, or just disorders and personality disorders, is with personality disorders, I think people sometimes underestimate the way in which someone really suffers. People tend to look at it like, oh, they have a personality disorder, as which is sort of like code for I don't like their personality, or like something is wrong with them, which you don't do. And typically when you say like, oh, they have a mood disorder or they have an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And I think it just has to do with the failure to understand what it is that is causing this person to feel the way that they feel. And one metaphor I like to use sometimes is this idea that with OCD, which is primarily driven by guilt and uncertainty and doubt, the sense is that I must be doing something wrong. Like I'm mishandling how to wash my hands, or I'm mishandling how to deal with this awful intrusive thought about hurting someone or something like that. And if I could just get it right, then I wouldn't have this problem, right? And so it's this kind of it's almost like I'm not getting enough oxygen. I use this metaphor in the book. I'm not getting enough. I'm trying to breathe, but I must be some kind of a fool because the way I'm breathing is not giving me enough oxygen. And in personality disorders, I'm talking sort of across the board, not just borderline personality disorder. The sense is that I'm breathing in any way that a reasonable person would breathe under these circumstances. If you felt the way I felt and thought what I was thinking at the time, you would breathe in exactly this way, and I'm not getting the oxygen I need, which means there's something wrong with the world or the environment or the relationship that's failing to provide me with the oxygen that I need. And I find this, infuriating or frustrating or overwhelming to the point that I don't know that I want to live in this world. And what's important to remember is that in both of these circumstances, wherever you position the locus of control, this person is suffocating. This person is terrified. And I think we just too quickly say like, well, they have a personality disorder, so, to heck with them. I think we need to really take another look at how we talk about personality disorders and understand this is someone who is trying to survive.
Yeah.
And maybe they need different skill sets to be able to do it. And that's what treatment is for.
Mm-hmm.
So borderline personality disorder, specifically speaking, we'll look at the different types of traits that come up. So there's 9 of them. So the first one is, and I think all of the OCD listeners here, and in fact, anybody listening who doesn't have a diagnosis is probably going to say like, oh, I felt that way before, I kind of get it, right? So the first one is chronic feelings of emptiness. So the emphasis there, of course, is on that word chronic. But when you think about OCD, so I'm going to try to describe borderline personality through an OCD lens. How many people with OCD have these intrusive, ego dystonic thoughts about just not being good enough, right? About, like with moral scrupulosity. Think about the ways in which your OCD separates you from people. You can't go to this event because of your OCD, or you can't enjoy this movie because of your OCD. So it triggers these feelings of loneliness, emptiness, lack of fulfillment, right? So in BPD, these things are chronic. So someone who has this particular trait is looking inside and they're just feeling like, there's nothing there. There's not a person of value there. There's not a person who has intrinsic worth that could be built upon. Another criteria, and I think this is the one that, just like with OCD, when we watch movies and TV shows of people with OCD, what do we usually see, right? It's people washing their hands. And in BPD, what do we usually see is people with this criteria: emotional instability in reaction to day-to-day events, right? So overreacting. In the DSM, they talk about intense episodes of sadness, irritability, and anxiety. Well, again, I would argue that many people with OCD also experience these intense episodes of irritability and anxiety. Right? Think about what makes people sad with OCD, everything that they've lost to their OCD. Think about what it feels like when you're trying to get your rituals right, but you just can't seem to do it. You can't seem to satisfy the OCD. That's going to make you irritable and angry. Think about the anxiety that you feel in the moment when, a bad word pops into your head or an intrusive sexual thought or something like that. And you just get overwhelmed and everybody around you is chill. But you are suddenly very, very upset. And I want to get in front of this. I want to be clear for those who are listening to this right now who have OCD. If you're resonating with this, I don't want the takeaway to be, oh no, now I have BPD too. What I'm really talking about is just that there are many people who have both of these conditions, and there are many people who have only one of these conditions. But in either condition, I think you can find some common ground. That's the only point I'm making. So that's 2. So 3, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So what I sometimes see when I'm working with clients with borderline personality disorder and how it impacts the therapeutic relationship is they're afraid that they're going to be rejected, right? And it might be because they've been rejected in the past, or it might just be this insecurity they have about abandonment. But it brings on a lot of distress because there's this sense of, my therapist is going to just tell me I'm too messed up and they don't want to help me anymore. And they're going to tell me to go away and that they don't like me. And so they might compulsively seek reassurance or try to, in more severe cases, almost create circumstances where the therapist is forced to reject them because their level of impairment or functioning is so intense that they need a higher level of care, or they might be acting out in some way that kind of forces the person to say, I can't help you, right? And then they prove their point. And those with severe OCD know what it's like to get so frustrated with the uncertainty that they would rather find out that their fear is true and get it over with than get some feedback about how, like, it's probably not going to happen, just deal with the uncertainty. So in this case, someone might, out of fear of being rejected, force themselves to get rejected just to get away from that distress. And you'll see this too, like someone, one of my patients described it, I think the term was doorknobbing. So this is at the end of a session, they're about to leave. I hadn't heard this before. And they're like standing at the door, and suddenly they have a bunch of amazing therapeutic stuff they want to talk about, or a bunch of questions, or they want to extend the session a little bit. And these are things that are kind of testing the boundaries, testing the fences to see, what's going to happen when I do this. And really, it's just an attempt to get reassurance that everything, that it's okay. But they might be so severe and frantic in their fear of abandonment that they, cross some lines that the leader they feel ashamed of. So the next one on this list of criteria is identity disturbance with markedly or persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Now I ask you, is there an OCD theme? Well, maybe there is, but very few OCD themes don't meet this criteria. Most OCD themes come down to a fear of loss of identity, right? I don't want to be a violent person who hurts people, or a crazy person who does weird things, or an unhygienic, irresponsible person who allows himself to get sick or spreads illness, or a person who is of a different sexual orientation than the one that I assumed I had. Like, we think about all the different OCD themes that come up, they're concerns about loss of identity. So if you just think of this in BPD terms as a kind of more extreme sense of identity disturbance, like, what if that term unstable self-image, what if the person I thought I was is not the person that I am? You could see how much they have in common here. And just a sort of statistical fact is really only about 5 to 6%, at least from what we know from the studies so far, of comorbid OCD and BPD. I have trouble believing that because I'm working in residential and they see so many people who have both conditions. But obviously I'm working with a specific sample of people. But even in that 5 to 6%, one of the things we know about the people with OCD and BPD is that they're more likely to have eating disorders. They're more likely to have mood disorders. They're more likely to have impulse control issues like skin picking. And they're much more likely to struggle with mental rituals. And where do we see the most mental rituals? It's in this harm OCD, sex OCD, identity disturbance, moral scrupulosity kind of stuff. All right, we're almost through it. Sorry, I'm starting to sound like a little bit more like a lecture than an interview, so my apologies.
That's fine.
All right, so the next one is I think another one that BPD is, for lack of a better word, famous for, which is impulsive behavior in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. So the examples usually given here are impulsive spending, impulsive sexual behavior, substance abuse, reckless driving, and binge eating. Now, we know that people with OCD are compulsive, right? They're planful, they're methodical typically. They might also have trouble with impulses, but they tend to be very intentional in their efforts to reduce their distress. But we also know people with OCD can get really emotionally dysregulated when they're triggered. And the more emotionally dysregulated you are, the more impulsive you are. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in your audience who are used to engaging in compulsions. And when they're particularly anxious or upset, their compulsions feel very impulsive. Should I go wash my hands? I'm just going to go wash my hands, right? Should I go online and check this thing one more time? I'm just going to go check it one more time. Right, it starts to feel less and less planful the more agitated you get. Now, we sometimes refer to things like compulsive gambling, compulsive shopping. I mean, these things actually aren't compulsive, they're impulsive. But they can also be compulsive in the sense of, let's say you're impulsively shopping, but you have to buy things in 4s, or you must buy another object because the first object you bought was contaminated by a bad thought. So there can be shared territory here as well. Another criteria is inappropriate, intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. So I think, especially in my experience with disgust-based OCD and just right OCD, I see a lot of anger more than I see anxiety around things just kind of like not being the way one feels that they should be. And I'm not saying that these people automatically have personality disorders. I'm just saying that anger is a pretty common feature in OCD as well as and also anger at oneself, right? For having bad thoughts. What's wrong with me? Why am I this way? Or anger at oneself for not being able or feeling able to resist compulsions. And then we have another criteria, which is pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by extremes between idealization and devaluation, right? So my partner is the best thing ever. My partner is not right for me. My partner is actually really bad for me. So anybody with relationship themed OCD is going to know what this feels like. So again, I'm not saying everyone with relationship OCD has borderline personality disorder, but it is true that both people with relationship OCD and borderline personality really struggle with the sense of, this person has to be the one or they're not the one, or at least that's one way that particular obsession can show up. And this can also happen in the therapy environment, right? Like I want a therapist who's compassionate and validating, who gets my OCD. Otherwise, they're cold and invalidating and judgmental, and they're trying to make me change. And that could be the same therapist. So for the therapist listening, you might notice in some of your patients when you're trying to motivate them to do exposure therapy, and they're like, "This is great. This guy gets me. He's going to help me. I'm going to go out there and do exposure therapy." And then you see the same patient the next week, and you're like, "All right, so now we're going to do this." And they're like, "You don't know how hard this is for me. Why are you pushing me? Everybody wants me to change," because that's how it feels to them in that moment, right? Yeah. That you've changed when you don't think you're the one to change. You think maybe it's the patient who's changed. Okay, we're almost there. So now we have recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, or threats, or self-harming behavior. So this is a scary one for many people with OCD who have unwanted, ego-dystonic suicidal thoughts, right? But it is also true that many people with OCD, particularly severe OCD, get suicidal ideation. They think, I'm not made for this world. Something's wrong with me. I can't stand having these thoughts anymore. They don't always act on the thoughts, but they might have these sort of gestures. They might find themselves researching suicide, or if they have the fear of self-harm, they might be engaging in some compulsive checking and testing that looks kind of suicidal in nature, but is actually just compulsive. And then even within self-harming, for people who do non-suicidal self-injury, such as cutting, we will sometimes see people compulsively hurt themselves as punishment for having a quote unquote bad thought, right? Or we might see somebody who has an impulsive urge to cut, but then they have to do it in a very specific, symmetrical way or a certain number of times because of their OCD. And then lastly, the last criteria here is transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And that's a big one. That's a very diagnostic thing, but I would just add that a lot of obsessions have, without being paranoid themselves, kind of paranoid undertones, right? Like, what if someone contaminated my food? Or what if someone didn't wash their hands after they did this? Or, what if somebody left that behind to test to see if I was going to fix it or move it or something like that? And then we also know that people with OCD have a slightly higher tendency towards dissociation, which is to say, we get immersed and lost in our stories, and we start to really think these stories are closer to reality than they are, without having to be delusional or psychotic or completely fail to distinguish between what is real and what isn't. We can still get kind of swept up in the way that any other person might get very swept up in a movie. They might cry if something sad happens in a movie, even though nothing sad has happened to them. People with OCD are very good at getting swept up in their narratives as if they were somehow living inside them. So that was a lot. Stu, feel free to take a breath. I need to take a breath.
That was useful, and I think, I think it just brings home of, obviously, I'm for diagnostic labels, but I'm also aware that they're not perfect by any means. And I think, you breaking that down, it brings it to life for me of how there is so much overlap, and the neat boxes of a diagnosis are only in the DSM or ICD. They're not in the brain, because the brain is just a beautiful mess of stuff, A
beautiful mess. I like that. Yes.
Of neurons, I guess. But there is overlap between a lot of different conditions, and because the brain doesn't work in straight lines, or nature doesn't do straight lines. So that was really interesting. And I think, yeah, you obviously many people listening may be able to relate to some of that may not meet the criteria for BPD, but still find some understanding in, oh, okay, I have that trait and that, yeah.
Yeah, the way I think about it is everybody has all traits. It's like a soundboard equalizer, right? So some things are raised or lowered to sort of like, this is the perfect sound for this song. And so the way you show up in the world is there's a lot of EQ that goes on. And you could look at any of these personality disorders, obsessive compulsive, narcissistic, even antisocial, right? And you can say like, well, I don't always follow the rules, right? And so I going through those 9 criteria, I think most people can relate to them to some extent. The question is like, how much do you relate to them? And do you relate to 5 of them a lot? And then you might want to consider that this is a co-occurring disorder. And why do you want to consider that? Because it might be a good explanation for why you're having such a hard time mastering your OCD. Because as everybody knows, working on your OCD, whichever approach you're taking, whether it's traditional ERP or ACT or something mindfulness focused, it's still at the end of the day asking you to do something other than compulsions. And that's terrifying for people with OCD. And how do you relate to being terrified? Does it bring on huge amounts of shame and self-loathing? Because it doesn't for everybody, right? Or does it bring on impulsivity? You can't stand it so much, then you go and you need to use a substance or something like that. It does for many, but it doesn't for everybody. So understanding that there might be this emotion regulation challenge or this interpersonal relationship challenge that's getting in the way of you being able to tolerate what it takes to overcome your OCD. If you could address that at the same time, then you have a better shot at freedom from your condition, from both conditions.
Yeah. Really good point. I just wonder, is it worth us talking about maybe causes of BPD or why people may develop BPD? I know it's not completely robust science, but there's obviously many opinions out there. Is it worth mentioning any of that if people are curious?
I mean, I could tell you what I've observed. I'm not sure that anybody knows. I mean, even with OCD, we have a lot of research. Yeah. We can't really point to the thing that causes it. We know that it's influenced by genetics, but we can't find the gene. We know that it's influenced by the type of family that you're raised in, but we can't point to the type of family and say, well, this kid's definitely going to get OCD.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably true as well for personality disorders. The thing that I find the most consistent among those people who I've worked with who have borderline personality disorder is extended periods of chronic invalidation. So that might be coming from abusive parents or abusive household. It might come from a series of traumas, right? When you think the world is one way and the universe tells you it's a completely different way, right? It's no longer safe to go outside. It's no longer safe to drive a car. It's no longer safe to trust your body because you've got some, medical illness now or something like that. That's a form of invalidation, right? The universe also validates and invalidates us, not just people. And I think that kind of jostles your ability to stay stable when times get tough and your emotions go all over the place and you stop trusting people and you stop trusting yourself. So if I had to point to something and say what's the most consistent, it's these extended experiences of not being seen and of not being understood, which happens to a lot of people with OCD. I'm sure I've seen many people with OCD with and without BPD, but especially with BPD, who spent a very long time with quite severe OCD and nobody noticed. And they didn't tell anyone. And they just were kind of just getting by.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's horrible, right? I agree on BPD, and it kind of when you understand if many of these people have had this challenging upbringing at times, it's no wonder they develop these symptoms. It was their brain doing what it needed to do to survive. But now, obviously, especially if the danger, so to speak, is gone, then this is where the symptoms may get people into trouble in relationships and other stuff.
Well, one of the ways that I've heard personality disorders in general talked about is that they're brilliant strategies that helped you survive childhood that no longer apply to adulthood.
Yeah.
But absolutely. You don't know that. So you're still using them, you know?
Yeah. And I guess it's risky to drop those strategies, right? In the same way it's risky to drop compulsions. Because what happens
Right.
if my fear comes true? Or what happens if relationships are terrible and I get hurt again? Or um,
Yeah. And, one of the things that I like when someone has more than one disorder, which is to say most people. I mean,
mm,
I read recently that if you have OCD, you're 52% likely to have a co-occurring other condition. Um, and so that's more than half, is what I'm saying. Um, you take something like harm OCD, right? What if I'm the type of person who would snap and hurt my child, as an example, right? So this is a common form of OCD. It's treatable. Uh, and most people who have this form of OCD have what we would call good insight. They say, I know I would never hurt my child. I feel insane. I feel like I can't believe I'm having these thoughts. I'm embarrassed by these thoughts, and yet they're vivid. They come as images. They make me so anxious. I don't want to be around my child because it's ruining our relationship is all I think about. I can't be around knives, et cetera, et cetera. And they're coming asking for help. They're saying, I know this isn't me, but I don't feel confident to just act like it's no big deal. And you could tell them, like, I mean, we don't really do this so much in therapy, but you could say, like, yeah, but really, like, you're not gonna do it, right? And they would say, yeah, I know, right? If you look deep in your heart. Now, if you add borderline personality disorder to the mix, and one of the criteria that you struggle with is this unstable self-image, when they look into their heart of hearts to find that solid foundation that says you would never do this. This is crazy. This is OCD. You don't need to worry about this. It's like deep in there. Like, come on, but really, Well, someone with BPD might be looking for that and find their book of their true self and open it up, and in that moment find a blank page. And think about how terrifying that is. When they say, I really don't know. Like, there's a part of my gut that feels like I would never do this thing, but the part of my mind that I look to that says, hey, you know who you are, shouts back, no, you don't know who you are. So that makes treating something like harm OCD or any of these taboo thoughts or unacceptable thoughts OCD much more challenging. They have to take a much greater leap of faith in treatment than someone who can say, I think this was John Grayson has this thing in his book about the gun test, right? This idea that you had to answer the question correctly, you would answer it if there was a gun to your head. Well, they would double down and say, no, I still wouldn't know.
yeah, which makes it harder and scarier.
Yeah.
Wow. So there's that one, and then you also mentioned about the ideation and devaluation of people, and obviously that can happen to the therapist. Of, yeah, you're the best. You're my savior, and then now I hate you the next week. Obviously, I'm being dramatic in my terms, although I'm sure that can happen too. What other areas does having BPD alongside OCD complicate OCD therapy?
The one I see the most, besides the sort of difficulty that people sometimes have with the overvaluing or devaluing the therapist or the therapy itself, is the role that shame tends to play. So you're doing some kind of exposure therapy, it makes sense to you, you're ready to do it, you think it's going to be relatively low on your hierarchy, and then you do it, and then this voice in your head says, you're a terrible human being, you can't do this. And then you start to get anxious and uncomfortable. Maybe shame starts to arise. And you start to think, well, this is way harder than I thought it would be. And this voice in your head says, like, well, it's impossible because you're impossible because everything you do is wrong. And so, imagine when you think about how we do exposure therapy, a good OCD therapist is going to be doing a lot of coaching, right? They're going to be saying, like, they're not giving reassurance about the content of the obsession, of course, but they're going to be saying, hey, you're really fighting the OCD now, and I believe in you, and you can do this, and kick the OCD where it counts, right? A lot of positive, supportive talk happens, right? Imagine having a therapist that's saying, like, you idiot, you fool, like, you can't do this, you're going to fail, just like you failed everything, just like this is why everybody hates you. And I think so having that voice in your head that's competing with the therapist makes it more difficult. Mm-hmm. And then there becomes this confusion of, like, well, does this mean that my OCD is way worse than I thought it was? Or does this mean that everybody but me gets to get better from OCD? Like, yes, we have treatments that work, but not for me. And there then comes in that trait of chronic emptiness,
Yeah.
right? I'm not really a real person. I'm a pretend person who can't do the things that other people can do.
Yeah.
So I think the way in which borderline can interfere the most in the OCD therapy, it's like having a really, really bad therapist in your head competing with potentially your good therapist.
Hmm. Yeah, really good point. So whether it's BPD or not, because we all have that voice that I call it like the inner critic that's just telling us we're terrible. And obviously for some people it's really loud, others it's almost non-existent. But yeah, I would then with clients, I'm not speaking about BPD now, but clients with that inner critic, bring in some more a compassionate voice and try and raise that and like that to coach them through that, to drown out the inner critic. Is it similar to what you do, or there are other approaches you use to kind of help them ignore or devalue that critical voice they may have?
I mean, I definitely use the self-compassion. But what I also might do, because the other component here has to do with just emotional dysregulation, right? So now this person's dysregulated and they're not doing what we want in exposure therapy, which is, okay, I'm aware that I'm anxious and I'm doing this on purpose. And I'm going to relate to it the way that I would relate to being aware that my muscles are tired while I'm lifting a heavy weight, right? I'm going to celebrate it and engage it and say, this is the work, right? When someone with BPD is getting dysregulated, they might not be thinking clearly because they might start to dissociate, or they might be having suicidal thoughts or urges to cut or use drugs or do other harmful things. And so in addition to self-compassion work, I might just switch gears completely and say, okay, what is it that you need right now? What is the skill set that we should be using right now? I think in OCD work, we get very caught up in the idea that we're never allowed to make people feel better while they're doing exposures, because the point is to face the challenge, right? And then if you're, obviously if you're giving them reassurance or you're making them, feel better in some way, it's like lifting the weight for them, or worse, it's like, kind of compulsing with them. But in order to learn anything, you have to be present. And if you have a condition that's robbing you from being present, because when you get dysregulated, you become suicidal, we got to bring it down back to a level where you could learn that you can handle this exposure. We got to bring you back to the present. And that might mean stopping what we're doing and shifting gears completely, or it might mean bringing in a distress regulation, emotion regulation, or distress tolerance skill from DBT to just bring you down a little bit so you're staying in the zone. And that's going to vary from person to person.
Yeah, really, really good point there. And yeah, I guess, for those people that aren't familiar with BPD, is there anything you want to say on DBT? I know it's not necessarily particularly your area, although I'm sure you use it. Yeah, is there anything you want to say on dialectical behaviour therapy, if I can say it?
Yeah, sure. It's something I'm becoming more and more familiar with the longer I work in a residential environment. I see how useful the tools are. So it's another offshoot from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it uses many of the same ideas that we use in CBT for OCD, but it has a couple of different focuses. So there's four main elements to it, and I think people overplay. I wouldn't go ahead and say like, oh, DBT is a treatment for OCD. I think that's taking it too far. But I would definitely say that DBT is a useful skill set to have alongside your OCD treatment. And the four dimensions that it explores are mindfulness, which, as you know, I use a lot of in OCD work. I think it's important. Distress tolerance, which we use a lot of in OCD work, and it's important. Emotion regulation, and that's what I was just talking about earlier. Is this, like when your emotions are too intense, how can you downregulate? And can you do it without compulsions, right? Can you take a deep breath or do a body scan, or, do you need to stop what you're doing for a second and hold an ice cube or something and kind of wait for your feelings to come down a little bit, right? We do this when we're exercising, where we let our muscles rest between reps, right? Can we do this therapeutically as well? And again, the purpose of the emotional regulation is to keep you in the zone. It's not to take your OCD away. And then the fourth dimension is interpersonal effectiveness. So when people are dysregulated or confused or stuck in a world of overvaluation and demonization, they might lose their ability to think clearly about how to communicate to other people what their needs are and how to get them met. Right. So the caricature of the person with OCD, with BPD, who's slashing her ex-boyfriend's tires, or like, picking a fight with the manager at Walmart or something like that. That's a caricature. If you look at what really happening in those situations, is a person who's trying to communicate how they feel, and the part of their brain that puts things into words and says, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I need from you, here's how we can work together, is in brownout, right? So so DBT has a series of skills that if you practice them, you can remember them even when your brains aren't cooperating with you, so that you can get your needs met as it relates to other people.
Yeah, good point. Because typically when you're in that space, whether it's emotional dysregulation or anxiety, the upstairs brain, the intelligent part of our brain is not offline, but weakened because it's overpowered by this emotional part. So it's interesting, how DBT does that. Because, it's why when we're so triggered with anxiety, we can't remember what we need to do, the mindfulness or the leaning into it, because we can't readily access that information without training.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the complaints that I've heard from patients who are being asked to do DBT in a residential program is that they sometimes find it a little bit infantilizing, where it's like, well, these are just skills that everybody should know, right? These are basic skills, and I already have these skills. I know how to write a letter. I know how to calm down when I'm upset. But the thing is, like, but you're not upset right now, right? The thing is, like, when you become upset is when you need to use these skills, and you might not remember. And so giving them acronyms that are easy to remember and practicing them when you're actually well. And it's the same thing with mindfulness, right? And people only use mindfulness as a strategy to relax. They never, even when they use meditation, for example, as a strategy to relax, they never actually develop strong mindfulness skills, because it's not something they're practicing unless it's an emergency situation. And then an emergency situation arises, and the last thing a person thinks of when they're freaking out is, oh, I know, I'll meditate, right? It has to be more organic than that. It has to be a part of your life already. So these are, I see DBT as, if there's skills that you don't know, they're worth knowing. And if there's skills that you do know, they're worth knowing in such a way that you can easily recall them when you really need them, when you can't rely on yourself to automatically think clearly.
Absolutely. It always reminds me of sailing. And if you got to learn to sail on calm seas, you can't learn to sail in a storm, because you'll capsize. And well,
that's a great metaphor.
So is there anything else you want to say on this topic before we change subjects?
I think we covered a lot in a pretty short period of time. No, I'm good unless you have a specific question. I just hope the message. I just hope the message there is that we all show up in different ways, and whatever it is that you're struggling with, there are ways to suffer less.
Yeah. Good point. And of course, your book's coming out next year sometime, and of course, when it does, I will promote it and push it out there, and and obviously, come back on too with your co-author as well. We can do another one in it. Yeah. So, lastly, before we finish, then, you've got a billboard in Baltimore. What do you want written on that billboard?
I always think of these great ideas after I talk to you, and then before I talk to you, I always forget. I was going to ask the billboard question.
Yeah.
I think for this one, I'm just going to say, you're stronger than you know. I may have used that one before, but it's still true.
I'm not sure if you have. Either way, it's still true. Thank you. So look, thank you so much, Jon, for your time and expertise. It's always great to catch up.
Thanks a lot, Stu. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.